I had been looking forward to that dinner for weeks. It wasn't often we all sat around the same table anymore. My son, his wife, my daughter, and the grandkids. I used to dream of moments like this. But something felt different this time. The tea. Air in the room was thick, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. I tried to ignore the feeling, brushing it off as anxiety or age catching up with me. I smiled, poured myself a glass of water, and took a seat at the far end of the long dining table. I noticed the way my daughter-in-law avoided eye contact. My son, who used to call me every other day, barely looked up from his phone. My daughter seemed restless, like she was waiting for a cue. The kids whispered among themselves, throwing glances my way. Still, I held on to hope. I asked about work, about school, about life. My questions hung in the air unanswered. Then came the moment that changed everything. My son looked up, eyes cold, and said, "Dad, can you not speak too much tonight? Just enjoy the food." The room went silent. He smiled slightly, like he thought it was a polite request, but it felt like a slap to the face. The man I raised, fed, clothed, loved, was now telling me to be quiet in my own home, the home I built, the table I paid for, the lives I helped create. I looked down at my plate, my appetite gone. I thought of my late wife and what she would say if she had seen this. I had swallowed disrespect before, for the sake of peace, for the sake of family. But this time, something inside me broke. My hands trembled, not with age, but with restraint. I reached for my glass again, and it rattled softly against the table. I caught my reflection in the water, old, worn, forgotten. That's what I had become in their eyes. Relic of a man they once needed. I sat through the first course in silence. They talked about their jobs, their vacations, their children's schools, as if I wasn't there. I nodded, smiled when appropriate. But inside, a storm was brewing. They had no idea what I had planned, because this time I came prepared. You see, I had rewritten my will just 2 weeks before. I had sat in my lawyer's office, pen in hand, rereading every line. I had removed names, added others. I made sure every word reflected my truth, not their assumptions. They thought I was weak. They thought I had no fight left in me. But they had forgotten who I was before I became grandpa or dad. They had forgotten the man who built everything they now took for granted. So I waited. I let the tension simmer. I listened to them talk about the house, how they planned to renovate once it was theirs. I listened as my daughter-in-law joked about moving my things when the time came. As if I wasn't sitting right there, I looked at her and smiled. "Would you like me to speed up the timeline?" I asked calmly. She laughed awkwardly, not realizing I wasn't joking. My son looked up, confused. "What's that supposed to mean, Dad?" I pushed back my chair slowly, stood up, and reached into my jacket. I pulled out a folded piece of paper. My voice was steady but firm. "Since I was asked to stay quiet," I said, "I thought I'd let this speak for me." Silence again. Eyes widened. I could feel every heart beating faster in that room. I unfolded the will slowly, dramatically, and looked around the table. "This," I said, "is the updated version of my will, and tonight, since everyone's here, seems like the perfect time to read it aloud." The room was frozen in place. My daughter stopped chewing mid-bite. My grandson turned off the game on his phone. Even the dog lay still by the fireplace, sensing the shift in the air. For the first time all evening, they were listening. I unfolded the pages slowly, letting the silence do most of the talking. They didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just about money. This was about memory, about respect, about finally saying what I had swallowed for too many years. "I'll begin with the house," I said. "The one I worked 30 years to pay off. The one you've all joked about inheriting." I looked at my daughter-in-law. Her mouth opened slightly, My son shifted in his seat. I've decided to donate it, I continued, to a local shelter for veterans, men who, like me, know what it means to give everything and still be forgotten. A gasp echoed from one side of the table. Someone dropped their fork. I didn't stop. I no longer believe in rewarding presence without participation. You show up when it's convenient. You visit when you want something. You remember me when there's something to gain. My voice was calm, but every word struck like a bell. Eric leaned forward. Dad, we didn't mean... I raised my hand. You meant exactly what you said. You told me to stay quiet, so I will. But the will won't. The tension cracked like glass across the table. My granddaughter looked down, suddenly fascinated by the tablecloth pattern. My daughter shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I once believed that family meant forever, I said, but forever requires effort, calls, time, respect. I raised. You all believing my love would be enough, but I see now it was only fuel. I could feel my heart beating in my throat, but I didn't stop. Not this time. I asked myself who truly showed up when I needed someone. Not birthdays, not holidays. The real days when grief took my breath, when loneliness sat at my kitchen table. I looked around the room, and none of you were there. Eric spoke again, this time softer. You should have said something. I did. You just weren't listening. I flipped to the next page. As for savings, investments, retirement, and funds, those have been redistributed. Some went to charities, others to people who made me feel human when my own blood made me feel invisible. My daughter opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. I had more power in that moment than I ever had raising them. This isn't punishment, I said. It's peace, my terms, for once. And in that moment, with nothing but paper and truth in my hand, I watched the weight of their assumptions collapse into silence. No one spoke. The air felt heavy, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. I could see in their eyes that this wasn't what they expected from me. The quiet old man had found his voice, and it carried weight. I folded the will and placed it on the table with care. You wanted me quiet, I said. But you forgot what silence can build over time. It becomes stone, it becomes a wall, and tonight I stopped pretending that wall wasn't there. Eric sat back in his chair, arms crossed now. Dad, this is a bit much, don't you think? I tilted my head slightly. Is it? Or is it finally enough? My daughter's voice trembled when she spoke. You're hurt. We get it. But this feels cruel. I turned to her. Cruel would have been dying quietly with these words, still locked in my chest. I stood up, pushing my chair back gently. I gave my entire life to this family. My health, my dreams, my energy. And when I finally had nothing left to give but time, none of you wanted that either. They watched me like strangers. I don't need gifts. I don't need grand gestures. I needed a phone call, a visit. A question that wasn't about money. My voice cracked slightly, just for a second. But I didn't let it stop me. When your mother died, I thought I still had you all. But grief revealed the truth. I was alone. Eric looked down at his plate. My granddaughter had tears in her eyes but didn't speak. My daughter whispered, "We didn't know you felt this way." "That's the problem," I replied. "You didn't ask." I walked to the sideboard and poured myself a glass of wine. I rarely drank anymore, but tonight was different. Tonight was a toast to truth. I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm doing this because I finally understand my worth, and I won't let it be written in invisible ink anymore. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. Time seemed to hold its breath. For decades, I said yes to everything. Sacrifice sleep, health, happiness. For birthdays, field trips, braces, tuition. I didn't expect repayment, but I did expect remembrance. I turned to Eric. I expected you to look at me and still see your father. Not a burden, not a placeholder. He didn't respond. I brought this will tonight because I knew you'd never really hear me otherwise. You only listen when money's involved." That sentence hit harder than I expected, but no one denied it. I looked at each of them, slowly, deliberately. I wanted them to feel it, not just the words, but the history behind them. Years of quiet dinners, missed calls, forgotten holidays. I turned toward my son. "Do you remember the time I drove 4 hours to bring you a spare tire?" He nodded silently. "That was the last time you called me for something that wasn't financial." His wife shifted uncomfortably next to him. "You said I talk too much," I continued. "But I think the real problem is I make you remember. I make you remember what I gave and what you took for granted. I make you remember that your comfort came at the cost of my silence." My daughter finally spoke. "You're right, Dad. We messed up, but why punish us like this? Because I stopped believing change comes from guilt. Change comes from awareness. And tonight, I want you to be wide awake." I walked around the table now, one slow step at a time. Not with anger, but with a quiet power I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about rage. This was about reclamation. I've lived 70 years on this earth, 50 of them for other people. I gave until there was nothing left. And when I finally needed something back, all I got was silence. Eric looked at me. We assumed you were fine." "That's the thing about assumptions," I replied. "They protect the person making them and destroy the one they're made about." I stopped at the end of the table. I used to be scared of dying alone, but tonight I realized I was already doing that, and none of you noticed. No one moved. No one dared speak. I don't want a eulogy full of lies. I want a room that knows the truth, and the truth is, this will reflect exactly how I've been treated. And with that, I folded the paper again, set it down in the center of the table, and said, "Dinner is served." No one touched their food. The roast sat steaming in the center of the table, untouched. The wine glasses full. The air, so thick you could cut it with a knife. I remained standing, watching them squirm in the silence they once asked me to keep. Only now, they wanted me to stop talking again, for different reasons. Not because I was rambling, but because every word hit harder than the last. Because every truth exposed the version of themselves they didn't want to see. My daughter finally whispered, "So what happens now?" I picked up my fork. Now I eat. You all can stay, or you can go." "But the will—" Eric began. "It's done," I said simply. "Signed, witnessed, filed." He blinked. "You really gave it all away?" I nodded. "To people who showed up when you didn't." "Like who?" I looked at him. "You wouldn't know them. You never stayed long enough to find out who they are." My granddaughter teared up. "Grandpa, I didn't mean to hurt you." I softened my tone just slightly. "Then don't hurt the next person who loves you by forgetting to show up." "People don't leave because of anger," I added. "They leave because they're tired of feeling invisible." I paused, letting the weight of those words settle like dust on their shoulders. I was never asking for much, just to matter, just to be included, just to be asked how I'm really doing. My daughter looked down at her lap. Her lips moved, but no words came out. I took a bite of the roast, still warm, still tender. I made it myself that afternoon. No one had offered to help. They assumed the old man would take care of it, like always. Tonight, it tasted like closure. I chewed slowly, thoughtfully, swallowed with ease. I didn't owe them bitterness. But I didn't owe them silence anymore either, and that's when I realized I hadn't lost my family. They had lost me. Eric leaned back in his chair, his jaw tense. He looked like he wanted to argue but didn't know where to start. Maybe because deep down he knew there was no defense. "Not this time. I didn't think it would come to this," he muttered. "You never think it'll come to this until it does," I replied. "You treat people like they'll always be around, like love is a contract with no expiration date." My daughter tried again. We were busy. Life happened. I shook my head. I know what busy looks like. I lived it for 40 years, and I still made time for every school play, every cold, every scraped knee. I looked at her and asked quietly, "Can you say the same about me?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. I stood and took my glass of wine, walked toward the fireplace. Above it hung the only family photo I had left on the wall. It was from the early 90s, back when their smiles weren't forced and my presence was still wanted. I leave that photo up to remind myself who we used to be, I said. But sometimes who we used to be isn't enough to excuse who we've become. My grandson finally spoke. Does this mean we're cut off forever? I turned slowly. That depends. Do you plan on calling me before the next funeral? The table went still again. The kind of stillness that makes you question everything. The kind that doesn't go away with apologies, only with action. I could see regret dawning on some faces, but not all. Some were angry, some were ashamed, and a few just looked confused, like this wasn't the script they were expecting. But that was the point. For the first time, I wasn't playing a role in their performance. I was rewriting the story on my own terms. The fire crackled behind me, filling the silence with its own quiet truth. I took a sip of wine, slow and deliberate, and let it warm me from the inside. Not the drink, the moment, the realization that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for choosing peace. Eric stood up suddenly. "So what, Dad? You're just done with us?" I raised an eyebrow. Done being ignored? Done being disrespected? Yes, absolutely. He opened his mouth again, then closed it. For once, he didn't have the last word, and it rattled him. "I'm not erasing you from my life," I added. "You already did that yourselves." I paused, letting the words settle. I just made it official. My daughter looked like she wanted to disappear into the chair. I remembered when she used to crawl into my lap just to hear bedtime stories. Now she couldn't look me in the eyes. That's what hurts most, when love outgrows you but not the memory of you. "I didn't raise you to be cruel," I said, "but I see now I raised you to be comfortable. Comfortable enough to think I'd always be there, that I wouldn't notice the absence, that silence wasn't betrayal. No one touched the food still sitting on their plates. It had gone cold, like the space between us. I used to think love meant giving everything," I said. "But now I see love is also about what you protect. And tonight, I'm protecting what's left of me." My daughter-in-law finally broke her silence. "This is petty. You're just trying to make a scene." I turned to her, calm. "No, a scene is what you make when you want attention. This is what you make when you've finally had enough." I set my glass down, walked back toward the table, and placed the will right in front of Eric. "You don't have to read it now," I said. "But when you do, just know every name in there earned their place." Eric stared at the folded will like it was a bomb waiting to go off. His fingers hovered over it, but he didn't touch it. Maybe he thought if he left it alone, none of this would be real. But it was. It had been real for years. "You think this is about money," I said, my voice steady. "It's never been about money. It's about value. Not what I gave you, but how you valued me." My daughter spoke. "But we still care about you," I cut her off. "Caring isn't a feeling. It's an action. It's the calls you didn't make, the visits you skipped, the birthdays you ignored." A long pause followed. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the antique clock I kept on the mantel. The same one Eric had once asked to inherit. "Time," I said, turning toward it. "That's all I ever wanted from you. Not your money, not your apologies. Just your time." My grandson looked confused. He was too young to understand the weight of a will, but old enough to recognize disappointment. He saw it on my face, felt it in the room. Maybe one day he'll remember this night and learn from it. "I rewrote my will because I couldn't rewrite your priorities," I said. And I'm too old to keep begging to be noticed. I pulled out a small photo from my coat pocket. It was of me and their mother taken decades ago. She stood by me through everything, and if she were here, she'd be standing with me now. She used to say, if they only come around when there's cake, they don't deserve a seat at the table. I smiled at the memory. Guess I finally took her advice. My daughter began to cry softly. She covered her face with a napkin, but no one moved to comfort her, not even Eric. They were all still frozen in the gravity of what was happening, of what had already happened, and for the first time in years, I felt free. I walked to the kitchen to refill my glass. Behind me, the room stayed quiet. No footsteps, no chairs moving, no voices, just the sound of me living, while they sat in the mess they'd made. For once, I wasn't the one left behind. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the porch light flicker. I had changed that bulb last week, something Eric used to do for me. Used to. That phrase had become the anthem of our family. He used to visit every Sunday. She used to call me after work. They used to bring the grandkids over to help with chores. And I used to believe it meant something. But now I saw the truth. Convenience had replaced connection. They gave me moments when it didn't cost them anything, but love without effort is just performance. And I had front row seats for years. When I returned to the table, the food had gone cold. It didn't matter. None of them were eating anyway. They were too full, on entitlement, on assumption, on guilt they'd never admit. And now I was the only one actually digesting reality. I don't expect you to understand this tonight, I said calmly. But maybe someday, when you're in my position, you'll look around the table and see the same empty space where love used to live. They listened. They had no choice now. Eric finally picked up the will and flipped through the pages. His eyes scanned names he didn't recognize. Organizations, caretakers, old friends, people who showed up, people who asked how I was. I watched him try to make sense of it. His lips pressed tight, as if holding back something, anger, regret, or maybe just shock. But I wasn't here for closure. I was here to give myself permission to be done. Eric set the will down slowly, as if afraid it might bite. He looked at me, finally, really looked at me, not through me, not past me. His eyes searched mine for something familiar, but what he saw was a man he hadn't bothered to know in years. I didn't realize it had gotten this bad, he said, and I nodded. That's the problem, son. You didn't realize anything. You assumed I'd always be waiting, watching, grateful for crumbs. His wife scoffed softly. You're acting like a martyr. I didn't even flinch. No, I'm acting like a man who's done begging for love he's already paid for. My daughter tried again. We can fix this. You don't have to do this now. This didn't start now, I said. This started a long time ago. Now is just when I finally decided to stop pretending it was fine. I turned to the window. Outside, the garden lights glowed over the path I once used to carry each of them on my shoulders. I remembered birthday scavenger hunts, late night, stories under the stars, snowball fights in the winter that ended in cocoa and laughter. They had forgotten those days. Or worse, they remembered them only as childhood fantasy, but to me, they were the years I gave everything. And now, they barely remembered to say happy birthday. I'm not asking for grand gestures, I said. I'm asking for effort, for honesty, for respect. They nodded, but their silence told me they still didn't get it. You can't fix what you don't admit. I hope one day you understand, I continued. Not for my sake, but so you don't do to your children what you did to me. The room seemed smaller now, tighter, like the truth had taken up all the space they used to fill with noise. No one touched their drinks. No one reached for dessert. And for once, I wasn't the one cleaning up the mess. I was simply standing, in the clarity of my own voice. I moved slowly back to my seat, but not because of age. It was the weight of everything I'd carried for so long finally shifting. This wasn't fatigue, it was release. And it felt like the first honest breath I'd taken in years. Eric was still holding the will, his hands now trembling slightly. He wasn't angry anymore. He was realizing this wasn't just a threat, it was a decision, a declaration of worth, of boundaries that should have been drawn long ago. My daughter cleared her throat, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad, what do you want from us?" I leaned in, meeting her eyes with more strength than she expected. I wanted to feel like I mattered. I wanted to be missed, I continued, to be remembered. Not when you needed something, but because you genuinely cared. I looked down at my hands, still steady. They used to reach for you when you were scared. Now they reach for silence. The fire had gone low in the hearth. I didn't stoke it, let it burn out like the illusions I'd finally let go. Warmth had to come from more than flame. It needed presence, and presence was the one gift they kept refusing. I cooked this meal because I thought maybe, just maybe, we could feel like a family again. I looked at the untouched plates, the half-full glasses, and yet the only thing that was consumed here tonight was me. They all looked exhausted now, not because I had attacked them, but because I'd finally told the truth. And truth, when ignored for too long, rots everything around it. You either confront it or choke on it. "I won't apologize for making you uncomfortable," I said, "because I've been uncomfortable for years, sitting quietly, hoping you'd notice I was disappearing." Eric set the will back down gently this time. His eyes were glassy, but he didn't speak. Sometimes the deepest apologies never find words, and sometimes they come too late. I leaned back in my chair, finally at ease. Not because everything had been resolved, but because I had finally said everything that needed saying. That in itself was peace. "I'm not angry," I said quietly. "I'm just done pretending." The difference landed like thunder across the room. They knew what I meant. They just never thought they'd hear me say it out loud. My daughter whispered, "We should have done better." I nodded. "And you still can. But not for my money, not for what's written on paper. You do it because it's right. Because one day someone might make you feel this forgotten." Eric looked toward the fireplace again, as if searching for a time machine in the ashes. There was no going back, only forward. And even that wasn't guaranteed anymore. Not with me. I didn't raise children to inherit things. I raised them to be kind, to be present, to show up. Somewhere along the way, you decided those lessons didn't matter anymore. My voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. They were hearing me now, not just listening, but hearing, and maybe, finally, feeling. The people in my new will. "They aren't perfect," I said. "They're just consistent. They checked in. They sat with me on hard days. They asked questions that weren't about bank accounts." My granddaughter wiped her eyes and finally said, "I'm sorry, Grandpa." It was the first honest thing said at that table in a long time. I gave her a nod, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. We would see what she did with those words after tonight. "I'm not bitter," I said one last time. "I'm just finally honest. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a background character. I felt like a man who had taken his place at the head of the table again." After that moment, something shifted in the room. Not drastically. No dramatic apologies, no group hugs, but something subtle. A weight lifted. A silence that didn't sting this time. It was like they finally realized they weren't entitled to my forgiveness. They had to earn it. Eric sat back down slowly, his shoulders no longer squared. He looked tired, not physically, but emotionally, like someone waking up from a long, comfortable lie. I didn't feel the need to comfort him. I had spent years cushioning their guilt, making excuses for their absence, softening the blow of their neglect. Tonight, I let them carry their own weight, and it looked heavy on them. "I always thought you'd grow into responsibility," I told them. "But I see now, growing older isn't the same as growing up." They all winced, but no one disagreed, because it was true, and they knew it. "I don't want revenge," I said. This isn't punishment. This is about clarity, about making sure that when I'm gone, I leave behind truth, not confusion, not entitlement. I poured the last of the wine into my glass. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do is walk away from people who don't see you. My daughter-in-law finally broke her silence again. We didn't know how lonely you were. That's the irony, I said. I was surrounded by people who called me Dad, and still felt like a stranger at my own table. The fireplace crackled again, small embers dancing upward. I looked into the flames and thought of all the birthdays I'd celebrated alone, the holidays I'd spent staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring. All the times I told myself maybe next year they'll remember. But they didn't, and yet here I was, the one making the effort to gather them, to speak, to share, to bring truth to the table they had used like a stage. Tonight, I wasn't the audience. I was the author. The fire had burned low now, a soft orange glow flickering across the walls. It felt poetic, warmth slowly fading from a room that once held my hopes. But I wasn't cold. I had made peace with the chill. Sometimes closure feels like winter, quiet, honest, and overdue. My daughter stood up and walked to the kitchen. She returned with a slice of cake she had brought, probably thinking it would be a sweet ending. She placed it in front of me gently. "You still like lemon, right?" I looked at it. "Haven't liked lemon since your mother passed." She blinked, caught off guard. "You always said I said it to make things easier for you, just like I smiled through loneliness, just like I stayed quiet when it hurt." The truth didn't need frosting anymore. Eric cleared his throat. "So, what now? Do we just go home?" "You do what you've always done," I said. "But this time it'll be with full awareness of what you've chosen." He opened his mouth to respond, then shut it again. Words don't work when actions are missing. My granddaughter reached for my hand, her voice soft. "Can we visit again, just to talk?" I looked at her, not with resentment, but with the cautious hope only elders understand. "That depends on what kind of visitor you plan to be." I wasn't interested in a flood of guilt visits. I wanted presence, not penance. I wanted to be remembered in life, not just mourned in death, and I was no longer afraid to ask for that. "I'm not cutting you out to hurt you," I explained. "I'm doing it to heal myself, to stop the bleeding that comes from giving endlessly into a black hole." They shifted uncomfortably again. It's hard to hear that love has limits, especially when you've treated it like a guarantee. But boundaries are just love protecting itself. And I had finally learned how to protect mine. The cake sat untouched, just like the dinner, just like so many moments before this night. And I let it sit there, a symbol of all the things they assumed I'd swallow. Not anymore. I stood again, not with drama, but with purpose. There was no need for raised voices or slammed doors. I had already delivered the loudest message of all, clarity. And clarity doesn't beg to be understood. It simply stands. "I'll walk you all out now," I said. They looked surprised, maybe even a little hurt, as if expecting some warm reconciliation, some final gesture of fatherly forgiveness. But this wasn't about comfort anymore. This was about honesty, boundaries, and letting them sit with their own discomfort for once. The same kind I had eaten with every holiday meal, alone in my own home. They gathered their coats, slowly, like prisoners realizing the sentence was real, and not just a warning. No one spoke. Their silence finally mirrored mine. At the front, a door, I turned to Eric. "I don't hate you," I said, "but I do need space from the version of you that forgot me." He looked down, ashamed, and nodded. "Sometimes love is letting someone feel the absence they created." To my daughter, I said, "You don't have to fix this tonight, but you do have to decide if you're capable of showing up in the future." She whispered, "I'll try." Trying isn't showing up, I replied. It's a start, not a finish. My granddaughter hugged me, tighter than I expected. A flicker of something real passed between us, the kind of connection that could survive if nurtured. I didn't speak. I let the silence be hers this time. They left one by one. No promises, no plans. Just a door gently closing behind them. And for the first time in decades, I didn't chase the silence they left behind. I embraced it. I walked back to the dining room, untouched dishes still on the table. It looked like a feast served for ghosts, but I wasn't haunted anymore. I'd finally fed myself something better, truth. I sat back down at the head of the table, alone now, but it didn't feel empty, not like it used to. This was silence I had chosen, not silence I'd been forced into. And there's a power in choosing your own peace. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Same rhythm, same sound, but it no longer mocked me. Tonight it felt like a companion, a reminder that time still belonged to me. I cleared the table slowly, deliberately. Stacked plates, folded napkins, emptied glasses. Every movement was a small reclaiming, not of the house, but of myself. In the kitchen, I packed leftovers into containers. Tomorrow, I'd take some to Mr. Green from next door. He always asked how I was doing, and never once made me feel like a burden. I left one portion for myself. The first meal I'd cooked in years that wasn't shaped around someone else's expectations. I poured a second glass of wine, turned on the radio, and let a little jazz fill the air. In the corner of the living room, a dusty photo album sat on a shelf. I opened it for the first time in years, not to dwell on the past, but to honor what it meant. There were birthdays I paid for, smiles I captured, hugs that once felt eternal. I smiled back at those frozen moments and then gently closed the album. Not everything needed to stay open. I placed the will in my desk drawer. It had done its job. It wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was a final letter, one they hadn't expected to receive so soon. I didn't know if they'd call tomorrow, didn't know if this dinner would change them. But I knew one thing for certain. It had changed me. The next morning, the sunlight crept in gently through the blinds. It lit the edges of the room like a soft reminder. A new day had come, and with it a new version of me, one no longer waiting for permission to speak. I brewed a cup of coffee, the same way I had for decades. But this time, it tasted different. Not because the beans had changed, but because I had. Bitterness had left the cup, clarity had taken its place. I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was crisp, and the neighborhood was quiet. A few birds fluttered across the fence, and the world moved on, just like it always had. Only now I wasn't trying to catch up. I wasn't checking my phone for missed calls that wouldn't come. I wasn't rehearsing words I hoped they'd say someday. I had already said what needed to be said, and for once, it was enough. Later that afternoon, a knock came at the door, soft, hesitant, familiar. I opened it to find Eric, standing alone, no folder in hand, no speech prepared. He looked older than he had the night before, not from time, but from truth. We stared at each other for a long moment. Then he said, "Can we talk?" I stepped aside, letting him in. But this time, it wasn't as a father welcoming a lost son. It was as a man opening the door on his own terms. And that made all the difference. We sat at the same table. No food, no will, no script. Just two people who finally saw each other clearly. He began to speak, slowly, carefully, and I listened, not because I owed him that, but because I chose to. Eric talked for a long time, not with excuses, not with defenses, but with something rare, accountability. He admitted the distance, the neglect, the quiet assumptions that I'd always be there. I didn't interrupt him, I didn't cry, I just listened, like I had done for most of his life. But this time, I wasn't shrinking to make space for him. He said he'd read the will. Said it stung, not because of the money, but because of the names he didn't recognize. He realized those names had stepped into roles he had left vacant. That hurt him. I could see it. And he needed to feel it. He asked if I would ever change the will back. I smiled gently. This was never about who got what, Eric. It was about who showed up when it mattered. He nodded slowly. I understand now. We didn't hug. We didn't tie everything up with a neat bow. Some relationships don't need closure. They need correction, and that takes more than a visit. It takes effort. He left shortly after, and I watched him walk down the porch steps. His pace slower, more deliberate. Maybe that meant something, maybe not. That evening I set the table for one, not because I was alone, but because I was whole. I made a simple dinner, lit a candle, and celebrated a life that had finally begun. To honor itself, the phone didn't ring, the door didn't knock, and still I felt full. Because sometimes peace isn't found in reunion, it's found in release. I took out a fresh piece of paper, not to rewrite the will, but to write something new. A letter to myself, beginning with 4 words. I'm proud of you, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it.